Hey everyone, our mission at Port City Community Church is to reach people and to help them walk with God. We believe that when we serve, we're following Jesus' call to put the people alongside us in front of us and to serve them. We believe that when we're serving, we are serving alongside other people and we are growing in our walks with God as we serve. We get to witness other people grow in their walks as well and see how God is working in their hearts and in their lives. If you would like to get connected to serve at Port City Community Church, we have a lot of opportunities and ways that we would love to get you connected.
Good morning, church. My name is Carson, and it is so good to be together, especially after the week that we've had. That video that we just watched on volunteering, I believe it's so important for us to talk about volunteering as a church quite often, because it's because of volunteers that our church is what it is. It's because of volunteers our church can happen week in, day out, and I really believe so strongly when we volunteer, our life gets better because we are no longer doing life alone, because life really is better together. And that's something that we really believe around here. So if you don't volunteer, please go by the gallery on the way out today. Talk to Lauren, talk to some of our staff, get more information about it, because we would really love to have you. This week has been a little bit of a long week. I think we've probably all spent a lot of time at home with our families because of Hurricane Dorian. It seems like it's been on our TV screens for like a week and a half, where it started in the Bahamas. And I read before coming out here that the death toll in the Bahamas is up to 43, and they expect it to continue to rise. And I really believe that it's our church's responsibility to pray for and to stand with the people in the Bahamas, as well as in the Outer Banks, and even in our own community, for those of you that experienced something during the storm this past couple days. And I would also encourage you that if you give here, you are giving to organizations like Convoy of Hope and Samaritan's Purse, partners of our church, who already have people in the Bahamas, in the Outer Banks, and even here in our building this week helping serve our community. So just encourage you that way. If you want to lend a hand and be a part of that, Samaritan's Purse has an orientation after the 11 o'clock service today, which is this service. So go down to Studio 3 and check that out if you would. But being that we've had a long week, we just wanted to give everybody a minute to stand up, to talk to the person beside you, get their name, get to know them a little bit, see how you can maybe help them, and then we're gonna worship together. It really is good to be together. We don't say it lightly when we say that we want our church to be a family. And that's the sound of what family sounds like when we come together and we talk to one another. We get to know each other by name and understand each other's story. I really believe very strongly in that. I want to encourage us today as we kind of move into worship. Something I was reading this week, kind of in the midst of the storm. Psalm 20, David writes in verse 7, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." And I want to encourage us today as a people that I want to be that we that David is referring to. The we that says we trust in the name of God, we trust in the name of Jesus, we trust in what he came to give us, and that is life and life to the full. Even in the midst of the storms that we go through, we can trust that on the other side of that storm, God has something special for us. God has something new for us. And if that's you today, I just want to encourage you. God has an extraordinary plan for your life. And I believe over the next 10 minutes, as we stand together and we sing about him and the promises he makes to us every single day, I hope that we can approach him with confidence and with boldness from the grace that he so freely gives us. So today, I just want to encourage you to give everything that you have in worship, because God gave everything to have you. So let's worship in this place today.
You are has no authority. Your love, it won't let go. I know it won't, for I know your thoughts, your plans for me are good, and I know you hold my future and my hope. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Healing, freedom, as you speak favor over me. Faith is breaking all impossibilities. Your name has overcome. Your name alone. For I know your thoughts, your plans for me are good, and I know you hold my future and my hope. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Come on. Sing, I'm standing. I am standing on every promise that you made. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. Jesus, I will trust every word I hear you say. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. I am standing on every promise that you made. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. Jesus, I will trust every word I hear you say. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. Oh, Jesus. Come on, let's sing this together. I'm standing on. I am standing on every promise that you made. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. Jesus, I will trust every word I hear you say. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. I will see it come to pass in your name, in your name. Yes, Lord. For I know your thoughts, your plans for me are good, and I know you hold my future and my hope. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Your promises never fail. Thank you, God.
Walking around these walls, yeah, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, seen you move. You move the mountains, and I believe I see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I see you do it again. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I see you do it again. Oh, yeah. And there's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the water, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free? There is a cross that bears the burden. Another died for me. There is another in the fire. You're right here. Oh, you're right here. And all my dead left for dead beneath the water. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. And should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning, either way I won't bow to the things of this world. 'Cause I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the water, holding back the sea. Should I ever need reminding what power set me free? There is a grave that holds nobody, and now that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. Whoa, there is another in the fire. And I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to Him. I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between whispers. I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls came in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. Oh, nothing, nothing, nothing. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. And He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come on, lay in the space between all the things unseen and this reckoning. I know I will never be would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for that truth, that there's nothing that can separate us, that we can rest and know that you are standing right next to us. You're standing right next to us in anything that we were facing, anything that we were holding on to, or anything that we were just wrestling with. God, I ask that you would just continue to remind us that you are more than enough. You are more than enough. That God, you are more than enough. Can we just rest in that truth right there? That he is more than enough. Whatever we're facing, he is more than enough. God, I thank you for that truth, and I thank you for that time to just sit on that truth. And God, we would just hold on to that for the rest of the day, and as we move forward, continue to move in our hearts and just to see more of who you are. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys so much for singing. You may have a seat. And as you do, I invite the host team to come down and receive the offering.
Good morning. It is great to see all of you here. I know that all of us in this area gathered at all of our campuses have breathed a collective sigh of relief that we did not get any worse effects from Hurricane Dorian. Obviously, I think, at least for me, I don't know if your experience has been the same, just because of what we went through last year, it just makes it all the more personal for what's happening to our north and the Outer Banks, and certainly in the Bahamas. And it just makes me very grateful for our partners who are just doing everything they can to get into those areas, to be able to bring food and water and just the absolute essentials of what it requires to start the rescue efforts in those places. So we're grateful, Convoy of Hope, Samaritan's Purse. We're very grateful for our partners with people who are just willing to do anything to get into these places. And so we're privileged to be a part. We're continuing our series, did I say that right? Series. It sounded weird when I said, I was like, what is that? Called Closer. And it's essentially a perusal through the book of Hebrews. If you have, and today I'm going to give you some kind of a ball of clay in the beginning that you're going to have to kind of just listen to and process. Then we're going to form it and make it make sense by the end of the time today. That's what I want to do in our time today. I've been through Hebrews I've read it a number of times over the course of my life, but the last probably 4 or 5 years, just really tried to understand it. Hebrews is a great book in the Bible that helps you understand the Old Testament. It helps you understand how to read the Old Testament in your Bible. It's got great narratives, incredible stories, but it's not a book of rules that you take a rule and you apply it to your life. There's more to it than that, and I think the book of Hebrews helps us understand and sort of delineate between an old covenant and a new covenant. Not in the sense of the words on the page or the stories, but the old covenant that the people of God lived under in the first part of our Bible, and then the replacement of that covenant with a new one. And we talked a little bit about that last week, and I'll tell you, some of this is gonna sound strange, especially if you grew up in the church, because we are more accustomed to thinking under the old covenant than we even think that we are, myself included. And so what I wanna do is I wanna walk through this this morning and really help us to understand what we do when we come to God. And I've got two questions that I'm going to try and ask and answer today. And question number one is, how do you see God? Like, how do you see God? And then question number two is, what happens when you see him? So those two things, and a lot of you goes, well, it's easy. You just look around. But we all have answers to those questions. And that's why this series, I believe, is so important, because the way you perceive God determines your approach. We gave you these cards in the beginning and had you write down your perception of God, how you see him, how you perceive him. And again, the boards on all of our campuses are filled with people who see him beautifully, see him as God is love, or God is peace, or God is my healer, or God is my redeemer. And others of you see him as God is ashamed of me, God is disappointed in me, God is angry, God is full of wrath, or whatever these things might be. And your perception determines how you approach him. And what God did for us through his son Jesus was create a new way for all of this other stuff to happen, a whole entirely new way in which we live. It's why I think the early church called themselves followers of the way, before they were called Christians or before they were called followers of the way, this way that Jesus ushered in for us as we learn to live with him and follow him in this way. And that's why our mission is so important. Part of what's happening to me personally is the way I go about considering how to teach. I don't just flip through the Bible and go, oh, what should we teach on today? I try to pray and seek and ask and look for things that have been very helpful to me and where I'm learning and growing, spending time in that, and then try to figure out how do we lead our church in that direction. It's why I hammer quiet time and journaling and all that ad nauseum. Most of you are sick of hearing about it, although most people still don't do it, so I'll keep saying it, but you get the idea. Because these are things that when people say, Mike, how do you learn how to walk with God in such a way that it affects life change? And these are the ways in which I have found that to be true in my own life, in the circles that I've been privileged to be a part of, and then to lead our church into that. And over the years, I've been, walking with the Lord for a long time, and reading the Bible for a long time, studying the Bible for a long time, and been doing this for a long time. And what I'm gonna share with you today, what I'm sharing with you in this series, is probably the front end of a learning curve that may be the most freeing thing I've experienced in all my years of walking with Christ. And I hope that it's helpful to you in that way as well. So with that being said, we're gonna kind of jump in to this. Last week I left you and I asked you these 4 questions to conclude our time. I said, do you really know, do you sense, do you really sort of understand the fullness of God's forgiveness for you? Like, do you really believe and trust that you have been forgiven, that he really doesn't remember, that he's washed you white as snow? All the imagery and the language that the Bible gives us to talk about God's forgiveness for us. Do you know the fullness of that? Do you know the beauty of God's formation? Are you different because you've been walking with God? Are there things in your life that are different because of your relationship with him? Do you know the beauty of his formation, who you're becoming? Do you know that? Do you know, the third question was, do you know the freedom of his rule? Are there things that you've struggled with God with to go, God, how can you ask me to do that? You don't understand, I'm this. And then you sort of come underneath it and you trust it and you walk in it only to realize 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, oh my gosh, I can't believe how freeing it is to live under his rules. I've learned that in the area of money and sort of greed, like, God, how can you ask me to give things away? How can you ask me to give when I don't even have this? And just trusting him only to learn the freedom of that comes 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. I learned it when I was wrestling with like my own views on sexuality and what I believe God had called me to honor my body in that way. And God, how can you only one person and not before marriage, how can that be? And you wrestle, and then 20 years later, 25 years later, you realize, oh my gosh, I began to see the beauty of his rule and reign in my life. And each of you may have other lists that you've done that. And I use these illustrations because it's not like you do this in 2 or 3 or 4 days or 5 days. It's a lifetime. It's seasons. It's walking with him and learning and seeing his faithfulness over time. We're so quick and instant in our culture that we give up way too short. Incidentally enough, one of the messages of Hebrews, it says, I don't want you to stop short of entering into his rest, which means he doesn't want you to stop short of experiencing the fullness and the freedom that he's wrought for you, that he's made a way for you. So this is the picture of what's happening in Hebrews. The last question was, do you know the power of his love for you? Have you actually felt him breathe value and worth into your soul in those moments where you feel like you're worthless or you don't matter or nothing's ever gonna work out? You just really sensed that in him. I think the reason we don't is most often associated with the fact that we still view him and live through an old covenant way of doing things. So here's what we've kind of looked at. The old covenant starts off and it says, I've made a promise to you, and if you do these things, that promise will come true. So it starts with what it is that we do, and then it begins to move in a direction, and if we do exactly what we're supposed to do in the way we're supposed to do it, we will then be able to see. And so this is what really frames the old covenant. If you offer the right sacrifice, if you do the right thing, then God will meet you halfway and he will do what he said he's gonna do. It's just sort of this transactional exchange. I do something, then God does something. This was the essence of the old covenant throughout the entire front half of our Bibles. The whole thing, the temple system, all the laws, all the commands, all the sacrifices were all, we do something and then God does something. We do something and then God does something. If you remember last week, I drew my cute little sheep up here to talk about this. Remember? The sacrifices that we have, that we offer to him. And we don't use animals or wave wheat anymore. We make promises. God, I promise I'll never do this again, because we need God to do something for us. God, I promise I'll do this again. I'll give more money. I'll come to church more. I'll do some good deeds. I'll help some people across the street. I was gonna say old ladies across the street, but some of you need more help than the old ladies do, so you get the idea. And I said, I'll do some good deeds, and then I'll offer these to you, and then you'll meet me and do what you said you're gonna do. And our prayers are like this. Our prayers are like this. God, we're desperate for forgiveness. God, I promise I'll never. And we feel like our sincerity, our intentions will sort of be enough of an offering for God to then meet us halfway. And what we've been talking about is that what God did for us is he sent his son Jesus. And what I would encourage you to do, we're gonna talk more about this next week, is I would spend some time, I've been doing this personally, just spend some time in the gospel, listening and looking at the life of Jesus, what he said, what he did, what he meant by what he said. These are staggering things. What I realize is a lot of the things I've yanked out of Jesus' teachings to use to support my own old covenant view aren't even what Jesus meant. They're not even what he was intending. He didn't intend them the way we have used them in so many ways. And I could give you example after example after example, but I've got 26 minutes left, so I've got to keep moving. So God sends Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 1, the letter opens up, and we're gonna kind of fly through. We'll land in Hebrews 8 and 9. But he opens up and he says that Jesus was the creator. He was with him in the beginning. He opens up, he talks about he's a superior word, he's a superior way. He is the radiance of God's glory, the exact imprint of his image. We learn in Colossians that he was the fullness of God's deity to dwell in him. Jesus himself said, when the disciples asked him in John 14, said, Jesus, show us the Father. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus made no bones about this, that when you are looking for God, you look to Jesus. That's what he said. He's the radiance, the imprint, the fullness of deity. When we see Jesus, we get to see God. And this is exactly what Jesus did. He came, he offered a sacrifice. Hebrews describes it as a final sacrifice for sin. A final sacrifice once and for all for sin. And then it says that he sat down at the right hand of the majesty and he created and ushered in a new way. A new way. This is what we're trying to get our heads around, and more importantly, trying to get our hearts around. Because of what Jesus did, that we have this high priest. Some of you grew up in traditions where you had to have a priest mediate for you. You would go to confession or do this. I'm not saying anything disparaging. These are all systems that we use. I've grown up in systems that were not helpful to me, because it's old way of doing things. Jesus says you no longer need that mediator because we have one. That's the exact words in Hebrews chapter 4. Then you pick up in verse 16, and this is the invitation we're looking at. Jesus says, or the writer of Hebrews says, because Jesus has gone before us, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Let us approach with confidence. So the answer to the first question is very simple. How is it that you see God? You see God by drawing near to him, by simply coming. One of the things I love about Port City, people say this, I mentioned this last week, a lot of people say, Mike, if I came to your church, the walls would fall down. It's never happened. People come in here all the time and the walls don't fall down. And what people will say is Mike, I like Port City because I can come just like I am. And you are exactly right. And I don't mean your dress. You can come just like you are. We welcome people. We want you to come just like you are. What we want you to understand is that in no way do we believe God intends to leave you that way. Not for me, not for you, not for any of us. You come as you are. That's exactly his invitation. We approach the throne of grace with confidence, not because of what we've done, but because of what he has done. That's the invitation. We come to him. We read this again in James chapter 4, verse 8, I believe is the reference. We'll put the next one up. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And if you just block out the rest, that looks really good. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And you keep reading, it says, but cleanse your hands, you sinners. You feel that? And purify your hearts, you double-minded. Some of you are going, he's preaching now. Right? That's what I grew up with. He's preaching now. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. And almost all of us go, we can draw near if we do something first. And what do? You try to cleanse your hands, you sinner, you. And you go and you wash your hands. Or maybe in Jesus' words, you just cut it off. Or you try to do whatever you can to stop doing what you're doing. Purify your heart. How do you do that? How do you do this for real? A lot of you have made great efforts to do both of these things. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. I think this right here is where the struggle is, and quite frankly, where the struggle needs to be. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time trying to help us understand as we kind of continue to build this ball of clay. I'm going to keep waltzing through Hebrews. Chapter 8 talks about that we have a high priest. We have one who's gone before us. He has bypassed a system. And then he gets this is how he describes it in chapter 8, verse 6. But in fact, the ministry of Jesus that Jesus has received, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to the other covenant, to the priests, as the covenant of which he is the mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. The new covenant is established on better promises, and I underline better promises in my Bible. He keeps going, he says this, for if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. If the first covenant would have worked, he would have never replaced it with a second. He would have left well enough alone. And I love this, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. But God found fault with the people, and he said, and then in Hebrews chapter 8, he quotes Jeremiah 31. God found fault with the people, and this is what he said. A new covenant is coming. A new covenant in which I will be their God and they will be my people. I will write my law on their hearts. There will be no need for them to say, please teach us, for they will already know. I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more. What he's saying is This old way of us doing something and then we'll get to be his people, he'll bless us as his people, he'll honor his promises, is no longer that way. He says the first one didn't work because people broke it. The second covenant, you and I cannot break. I want to be very clear in this. The second covenant, the new covenant, cannot be broken by you or me. It can only be received or rejected. This is a very different way of thinking about this because it's no longer our behavior that keeps us from what it is that God has promised. It's based on a better promises, and those better promises cannot be broken by you or me because they are sealed with what God has done and what he has said. We don't have the power to break it, only to reject it. This is really important for us to start to get into our heads as we think about how we're going to approach him. He continues on and he wraps this section up with this. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And that which is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Now, I want to clarify what he is not saying is that the Old Testament is obsolete. It's not what he's saying. What he is saying is that the Old Testament needs to be viewed through a new lens. The Old Covenant is obsolete. Therefore, the Old Testament is God's revelation, his interaction with humanity under the Old Covenant. And now we get to read that and study that through the lens of the New Covenant. That's how we should do this. So, with all that being said, I want to turn our attention and I want to begin to ask the question, what is wrong with the old and what happens when we actually draw near to God? Two more places to look at. Again, bypass the system. Hebrews 7 says this. We'll put these together real quick. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. The law had no power to make anything perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. That's one. Going on to chapter 9, skip down. This sacrificial system that he explains in the first 9 verses is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and the sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. Have you experienced this? This is why we say the fullness of his love, the beauty of his formation, the freedom of his rule, that we don't experience this because we keep trying to do something in order to get him to do something for us. God, I want to feel the freedom of your forgiveness, so I'll do something and then you'll do that. I want to feel the freedom of your rules, so I'll do something and then you do that. We still operate under the old covenant. And these things never have the power to clear the conscience of the worshiper. These are only a matter, keep reading. These are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings. They are external regulations applying until the time of the new order. And the new order arrived with Jesus. So this is where we want to pick up and talk about this and try to understand this. The old covenant could never perfect you, and it could never clear your conscience. I don't know how many of you struggle with that. This was one of my journeys throughout a lot of my early years with God. I would say, God, please forgive me. Then I would do what I just asked for forgiveness for. You ever done that? You ever asked God to forgive you for something and then even added, God, I promise I'll never do it again? How many of you, and I want to see your hands, have ever promised never to do something again and then started counting how many days that it was until you did something? Perfect. See, I'm not alone in this. God, I promise I'll never. Then we start counting days. 10, 12. Oh, we're receiving his grace. We're getting close. And then you blow it, what happens? It's like chutes and ladders all the way back to 0. How in the world are you ever going to have a pure heart and a clear conscience in that system? The answer is you're not. So he set it aside and he ushered a new one. What we fail to recognize is this process works in this order, that we do something hoping that we will see something. What gets left out inevitably is that everything that we do in this direction actually shapes us and who it is that we become. It's this way, if we can do enough stuff, we'll become the person who is worthy to be in the presence of God. If you've been following along with me for any length of time, you'll begin to recognize this as encounter, formation, expression. The beautiful thing about the new covenant, it says that it takes and it reverses. It says the old order was the external that makes its way to the internal. And what Jesus came to do is said, no, I'm actually gonna flip that on its head. I'm gonna do something internally that causes something to happen on the external. It reverses the order. The old covenant works in this direction. The new covenant works in this direction. And here's why this is so important. Because there's a gap between here and here. And what we often fill that gap with in the old way is effort. And I'm gonna write promises or sacrifice or whatever we think we're gonna do to prove ourselves to God. If this sounds familiar to you, if your prayer life, if your approach to God sounds familiar, that you're gonna try more, do more, learn more, read more stuff, give more money, attend more Bible studies or whatever, if promise him that you'll do better, if this sounds familiar to you, it's because you are living under the old covenant. The new covenant is very different. This new covenant, the gap is over here. Why? Because we're invited to approach, and we encounter something. I'm not talking about seeing him and observing. I'm not talking about seeing Jesus and observing what he did in the Bible. I'm talking about reading the Gospels and sitting at his feet and encountering him and understanding his love for you and what he did for you on the cross. And that what the Bible teaches about the new covenant is that you have been made righteous and you were chosen and you were dearly loved. It says that you are holy. When you come to him, believing and trusting in what he has done for you, that's what he says about you. And all of a sudden, you've encountered something that you cannot possibly be true about yourself because you know you. And there's a gap between what it is that is said about you, what you encounter in Christ, and what is true about you in your life. And this is where this formative work happens as we sort of learn how to fix our eyes. Somebody said that looks like a bunny rabbit in the first service. I'll put some. We begin to see him as he is. What eventually happens, it affects how we live our lives, what happens with our hands and our feet. And what happens in this gap isn't a matter of effort and promise. What happens in this gap is really a matter of it's receiving. Receiving and availing. We are terrible receivers. Do you know that? This is why when someone buys you lunch, what do you always say to them? I'll get you next time. What's wrong with thank you? Like really, what's wrong with thank you? For some of you, this would be a great exercise for you. When someone buys your lunch, instead of telling them or feeling all that, I think we got a lot. Just say, wow, thank you. Do you know why? Because that's a posture of receiving, Most of us are so accustomed to getting what we could do for ourselves anyway that we don't even understand what it means to receive things. Has anyone received something that there was no possible way you could have ever gotten on your own? Here's a news flash. You have parents, don't you? My kids come in, my youngest daughter, she says, a couple years ago, we were talking about our tax breaks, and we get a tax credit we used to for our kid, which is at home. She said, why do you get a tax credit for me? I don't cost you any money. I'm like, I'd be rich if it weren't for you, right? We don't know how to receive. Whenever we do receive something, we're trying to figure out what we do with it or what we can do to make it up or what we did to deserve it. We're always trying to justify this. What the gospel is about is that we have been freely justified by our faith. That means when you show up to him saying, here is me, I trust you, you don't need to make any excuse ever again for what you have done or what you will do. You turn and you face in this direction. And you learn how to receive what it is that he has given to you. He has called you to be his child. Well, I don't deserve it. Right. So you just say, thank you. The old covenant, it's called the sacrifice of thanksgiving. In the new covenant, it's simply the overflow of what we experience. Gratitude is an overflow of us simply holding our hands out and trusting that what he says and does in and through our lives is grace. And we just say thank you. The beautiful thing is the posture is to receive and to avail, which means that whatever I receive, guess what happens to it? It becomes available for God to do anything he wants with it. I receive it and I offer. So I get forgiveness. Guess what happens? I make it available. This is why the big people say, Mike, how do you forgive someone for what they've done, blah, 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 blah. So because that's not the standard of the new covenant. Jesus didn't say forgive as to the degree in which you've been wronged by another person. He says you forgive as I've forgiven you. Under the new covenant, he doesn't even remember my sins anymore. Is this easy? No, it's not easy. That's why this process right here is so critical. And so this is what I mean, when you come, so how do you see God? You see God by drawing near. What happens when you draw near? What happens when you draw near? You get like chill bumps, goosebumps. Ooh, I got goose pimples. Jesus was near me today. Listen, I've done that. I want us to look at the originator of this original covenant. It was given to Abraham. Abraham, I will bless you, and through you, I will bless all nations. Abram, will you receive my blessing and just simply make it available in whatever way I choose to use it? That was the original covenant. They became known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because if you know the story, Abraham had Isaac, who was the child of promise. Isaac had Jacob and Esau. Esau was the swindler who swindled his brother Esau out of the birthright and became the inheritor of the blessing. He was the promised one through whom God would bless all the entire world, through Jacob now. So Jacob is going to meet Esau, and you can imagine if you swindled your brother out of the inheritance, your brother might not be super fired up to see you. So Jacob's already sending a bunch of sheep and goats and money and all kinds of stuff to kind of hedge his bets. And he gets delayed and stuck back. And here's his account. Here's what happens when he's alone with God in Genesis chapter 32. So Jacob was left alone, and a man came and wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Look at this. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome." This is an unbelievable passage, a picture of Jacob meeting God, essentially, whether it's an angel or a physical, we don't really know. And prevailing, overcoming, surviving. He gets to daybreak, he's wrestled, and it gets to the point where he's like wrenching, so that just touches his hip and pop, he's like, oh, he's gonna walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He says, "Tell me your name." He says, "My name is Jacob." He says, "Not anymore. Your name is Israel. Your name is Israel. And this is where the promise is gonna come from." Keep reading, look at this, I love this. And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" And then he blessed him there. Keep going. So Jacob arose and he called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Here's what happens. Here's what will happen when you enter into his presence, more than likely. There's going to be a wrestling match. Because some of you come to him and you get there and you're like, "God, I trust you, but this is who I am. This is how you've made me. This is what you've done. This is just the way it is." He says, "Oh, your name's not Jacob anymore. Your name is Israel." The first thing that's gonna happen is you're gonna lose your old identity and you're going to be reborn into a new one. And your old one isn't going away without a fight. I don't know if you're aware of this in your own life or not, but pride and self-sufficiency do not go away without massive resistance. I may be the only one who has self-sufficiency issues or pride issues, but I can assure you they don't go away easily. There are oftentimes we come, we think we know who we are, we think we know what God's gonna do, and we're sort of demanding from him, and he begins to wrench out of our fingers. Sometimes it is pain. Sometimes we get a hip touch, and it hurts. And he's pulling, he's doing something in us. He's helping us to stop giving effort and making promises and learn how to receive and avail. Here's what I think is really interesting. When Jacob is down, he says, I'm not gonna let you go until you give me your blessing, till you bless me. Do you realize that Jacob was demanding something he'd already been promised? Do you know what happens when you are demanding something that you've already been promised? You will never be free to receive it. This is so important for us to understand because a lot of us, when you hear people talk about the freedom they find in Jesus, you're over here, God, haven't I done enough? Don't I deserve some freedom? And you're holding on to this and you're demanding that him do what he says he's gonna do instead of just coming to him and allowing him to do what it is that he's already done for you. You can't find his peace, right? Jehovah Shalom. God, I've seen you reveal this week. I can't find any peace. Haven't I done enough? Aren't this, will you fix my circumstances? All these things you keep asking for. And he's like, would you please come and experience to know who I am as he reveals himself to you. See, the other thing I think is really interesting about this passage is the angel or God wouldn't tell Jacob his name. Now, if I'm wrestling someone and I've just whooped him, give them a new name, I'm like, my name is Mike. Don't forget. He doesn't tell him his name. I began to think, why in the world would he remain nameless? Like, why would he remain nameless? I think there's two reasons. I read a lot. You don't see a whole lot mentioned about it. You don't see much mentioned about it at all, but to me it's very interesting. It's like a question, like why in the world would he remain nameless? I think there's one of two reasons. Reason number one is because he already knows his name. He already knows his name. He's like, you already know who I am. That could be reason number one. And for some of you, that may be where you are. You're wrestling with God. You're trying to figure out what you believe about something or why God could be like this or why he could be like that. And those are all good things to try to figure out. But you figure it out as you come and you let him begin to open your hands and hear him say to you. And maybe what he's saying to you is, you already know me, right? I'm the God that you've been searching for the last 2 years or 5 years. I'm the God you've been running from. I'm the God you thought you walked away from. You already know my name. And some of you need to return to that place. There's another reason I think that perhaps he remained nameless. And the second reason is because I think this is at least really helpful to me. It's because he's simply revealing his name in a fresh way. He's revealing something new about himself that Jacob didn't know before. Maybe for some of you, that's what you need. You've been walking with God, and what you keep longing for him to do is what he did 5 years ago. What you keep longing for him to do is what he used to do. God, I wish I knew you like I did back then. He wants to meet you and reveal himself to you in a fresh way. If you look through the Bible, you'll see he was, Elohim, he was El Shaddai, and all these names were given. Then as you see Jehovah Jireh and Jehovah Rapha, Jehovah Roy, you see all these names given as God reveals himself to us over time, through experience, through a relationship with him. It doesn't come all at once. I was thinking about this, with my kids. My kids are 23, almost 24, and 18. And one of the hardest things to believe, because I've known them since they were born, is sometimes you look at them. I remember especially when they were like 14 or 12 or whatever, and you're like, it's so hard not to treat them like they're 2. Because I just know you as a 2-year-old, or I just know you as a 4-year-old, or I just know you as a 15-year-old, or I just know you as a 20-year-old. And what happens is this person becomes, and you learn all kinds of new stuff about them over time through the relationship that you have with them. I've been walking with the Lord for a long time. My plan was when I was 40 to have them all figured out, get a couple of holsters ready, and just fire sermons off about every issue all the time. That was my plan. It was a good plan. And God keeps revealing himself to me in ways that I did not know how he was. To be freed from having to do things, all the things that I struggle with and still do to some degree, to recognize that his power is sufficient to transform me if I will learn to receive and posture myself to receive and to trust and then to avail. What happens is when you avail, this stops being your effort to get God to do what you want, and it starts becoming fruit of his glory. And the beauty is, it has nothing to do with my effort or your effort. It's the way you've been intended to live. See, this is why we got to stop thinking about the gospel from this moral place and start thinking about it from this authority place. Because God has given you life through his son, Jesus Christ. He's given it to you. If we'll receive it and avail it. You know, there's no freer way to live. Here's what I want you to do. Here's your homework. This will be a lot of fun. Wrestle with God. How's that? Usually it's going to center around two things. It's going to center around, number one, your identity, or number two, your way. For some of you, you're like successful. You like get things done. You make things happen. And that's your identity. He's like, and you think because you're able to do a lot of things that God's really pleased with you. He's like, no, I want you to come. You belong to me. I'm your God. You're my child. I'm your father. You're my child. We're in a relationship with each other, and you receive and then you avail this. You're used to, some of you are so, you're trying to prove yourself so, just every effort, you're trying to make sure that people know who you are and how you are, and everything's this effort, and you are demanding and you're taking and you're all these things. And you're like going to wrestle with him. He's going to take that away and says, no, that's not who you are. You're no longer Jacob. And he's going to give you a new identity. That means you belong to him, and that you're free to receive what he's done for you and what he's given to you, and you're free to avail that to every other person. For some of you, your wrestling will be, you've got to stop demanding what you've already been promised. You're demanding that God do certain things. He's already promised them. What he wants is for you to come, not to keep doing something to get it, but to come to him, because he desires a relationship with you, not just your compliant behavior. What's really interesting to me, I thought this was kind of cool. When Jacob awoke from the wrestling match, he didn't wake up and say, I won. He woke up and he said, I lived. I found myself alive. This is really what it looks like. We're doing all these things to try and get God to give us a life. And he's like, why don't you come? I've already given it. And if you'll receive it, then you're free to give it. But what do I do? You come. You come just like you are. You wrestle with him. Some of you are holding on to an identity that you've defined yourself by so deeply, and you don't want to let him deal with it. He's going to begin to wrestle and wrestle and wrestle. For some of you, it's your way. It's something you just learned how to control, and it's your way. You're not going to be able to live this freely without some kind of wrestling match. And I would encourage you to do that. We're going to talk about how that plays out next week. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you. I thank you that you've made a way for us, a way of freedom and a way of fullness, that our conscience can actually be cleared and freed. And so, God, I ask that you would teach us within ourselves, where your law is now written, where your Holy Spirit resides, to teach us, to form us, to help us to see and to trust in this new way. Father, we thank you for your son, Jesus, who has made it available and possible and then has sourced it with his blood. I ask, Father, that you would just help us to step into what it is that you have called us to, leveraging the authority and the freedom that has been wrought by you on our behalf. And I pray that our lives would be used to bring glory to you in that way. And I lift this to you in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.